Something is changing in the relationship between the United States and Canada, and it is not subtle anymore. For months, we have been hearing increasingly aggressive statements coming out of Washington, accusations, threats, and now open frustration from Trump, from Pete Hegseth, from J.D. Vance. But what if these statements are not a sign of strength? What if they are a sign of something else entirely? Because the more closely you look at what is happening right now, the more it becomes clear that this is not about Canada losing ground. It is about the United States realizing that it may no longer have the upper hand. Canada-U.S. trade talks are expected to heat up in the next couple of months ahead of the mandatory CUSMA review. And while President Donald Trump has repeatedly said that the U.S. does not need Canada, some experts disagree. The CBC's Mike Crawley has been working on this story and joins us from Washington. Mike, I read your piece online with much interest. Let us talk about it. What kind of leverage does Canada have going into these talks? Yeah, Andrew, I have been looking at this question for a few weeks now, actually, because I kept hearing and reading about how much power the U.S. has in this relationship, how hard it is going to be for Canada to make any progress in getting tariffs lifted or getting the kind of trade deal that is actually going to be good for Canada. All of this is supposedly because the U.S. has so much more leverage than Canada does in this relationship, because our economy is far more dependent on exports to the U.S. than the U.S. economy is dependent on exports to Canada. But I got talking to quite a number of people who have some insight into how trade negotiations work, and there is a pretty broad consensus among them that Canada actually has quite a few points of leverage in these talks. In recent weeks, U.S. officials have intensified their rhetoric toward Canada, from Donald Trump repeatedly claiming that the United States does not need Canada, to senior figures like J.D. Vance openly accusing Canada of taking advantage of the American economy. On the surface, these statements sound like part of a broader negotiating strategy. But when you place them in context, a different picture begins to emerge. Because these remarks are not happening in isolation. They are happening at a very specific moment. A moment when trade talks are approaching and when the balance of power may be shifting. For a long time, the assumption in Washington was straightforward. The United States holds the leverage. Canada depends heavily on access to the American market, and therefore Canada would ultimately have to accept terms set by Washington. This assumption shaped the entire U.S. approach. Tariffs were introduced, pressure was increased, and the expectation was that Canada would eventually concede. But according to multiple experts and insiders familiar with trade negotiations, that assumption is now being challenged. Because behind the scenes, there is growing recognition that Canada is not as weak in this relationship as previously believed. From what has been observed over the years, when the president or his officials react most negatively to something that Canada does, when they are most aggressive in their rhetoric, that is a tell. That is an indication that this is an issue that really matters to them. And that is when Canada has leverage. There is a critical insight that helps explain what we are seeing right now. When U.S. officials react most aggressively to Canadian actions, it is often not a coincidence. It is a signal. Because in high-stakes negotiations, rhetoric is rarely random. It is usually directed at points of sensitivity, areas where outcomes matter the most. And according to individuals who have been directly involved in past Canada-U.S. negotiations, when Washington's response becomes more forceful, more public, and more repetitive, it is often an indication that Canada has touched on something strategically important. In other words, the intensity of the reaction is proportional to the importance of the issue. That insight changes how these statements should be interpreted. Because instead of viewing aggressive rhetoric as a display of dominance, it begins to look more like a reaction to pressure, a signal that the negotiating position is being challenged, a signal that the expected outcome is no longer guaranteed, and in some cases, a signal that the balance of power is shifting in ways that were not anticipated. This is particularly important in the current context because the frequency and tone of these statements have increased at the same time that Canada has begun to assert more independence in its trade and diplomatic decisions. That is not a coincidence. It is a pattern. And patterns in negotiations tend to reveal underlying realities that are not always stated openly. This is where Mark Carney's strategy becomes central to understanding the shift, because what has changed over the past year is not just Canada's position, it is Canada's options. Instead of narrowing the country's economic pathways, Carney has deliberately expanded them. One of the clearest examples is Canada's engagement with alternative global partners, including strategic moves that signal openness to deeper trade relationships beyond North America. These actions are not simply economic decisions. They are strategic signals. They communicate to Washington that Canada is not locked into a single outcome and that it retains the ability to pivot if necessary. And in trade negotiations, that kind of flexibility is power, because leverage is not determined solely by the size of an economy. It is determined by the availability of alternatives, the ability to absorb pressure, and the credibility of walking away from an unfavorable deal. Carney's approach has strengthened all three. By demonstrating that Canada is willing to explore partnerships beyond its traditional framework, he has introduced uncertainty into Washington's assumptions. Because if Canada can diversify its trade relationships, then the cost of pressuring Canada increases and the effectiveness of that pressure decreases. This is what changes the game. Not confrontation, not escalation, but positioning. The quiet construction of options that alter the negotiation itself. And that is why the current moment feels different. Because Canada is no longer reacting to pressure. It is reshaping the conditions under which that pressure operates. So how might Canada's energy markets play a role in future trade with the U.S.? No, clearly when it comes to leverage, crude oil is the biggie here. The U.S. imports more crude oil from Canada than it does from all other countries in the world combined. So I am told that Canadian negotiators are basically trying to see what is a way that they can leverage that resource, given all the uncertainty we have right now around rising prices and around U.S. access to oil from around the world. But the most important shift may not be diplomatic. It is economic. And more specifically, it is about energy. The United States imports more crude oil from Canada than from all other countries combined. That fact alone changes the entire equation, because at a time when global energy markets are under pressure, stability becomes a strategic asset, and Canada provides exactly that: reliable supply, geographic proximity, and political stability, all of which are becoming more valuable as global uncertainty increases. So the United States is indeed dependent on Canada. The timing of all this is critical. The war in the Middle East has disrupted energy flows. Oil prices have risen and global supply chains are under stress. At the same time, economic pressures within the United States are growing. The cost of living is rising. Voters are becoming more sensitive to price increases. And tariffs, which were once seen as a tool of leverage, are now increasingly seen as a source of domestic pain. This creates a very different environment, one which is full of extreme pressure for Donald Trump, because it means that the United States is no longer negotiating from a position of complete strength. It is negotiating under pressure. And energy is only part of the story. Canada also holds leverage in several other critical areas: access to critical minerals that are essential for modern industries, massive levels of Canadian investment in the U.S. economy, reaching into the trillions, and the ability to redirect trade toward other global partners. Taken together, these factors create a reality that is very different from the one Washington initially assumed. Canada is not dependent. It is positioned. This brings us back to the statements coming out of Washington, because when you look at them through this lens, they begin to make sense, not as declarations of dominance, but as signals of frustration. Because if the United States truly held all the leverage, there would be no need for repeated public attacks. There would be no need to reinforce the narrative, and there would be no need to escalate the rhetoric. The fact that we are seeing all three tells us something important. What we are witnessing right now is not just a trade dispute. It is a shift in perception. For years, the assumption was that the United States dictated the terms of its relationship with Canada. But that assumption is now being tested, because leverage is not fixed. It evolves. And in this moment, Canada has more of it than many expected. The statements coming out of Washington may sound aggressive, but beneath that tone, there is something else: a growing realization that the balance is no longer one-sided and that Canada is no longer negotiating from a position of weakness, but from a position of strength.